For days, the silence was louder than any headline. After the detention that sent shockwaves through social media and ignited endless speculation, Can Yaman disappeared from the public eye. No statements. No interviews. No carefully worded press release. Just silence. And in the world of celebrity scandals, silence is never neutral. It becomes a message of its own. Fans waited. Journalists speculated. The Turkish press filled pages with theories, unnamed sources, and half-confirmed claims. Some painted Can as calm and unbothered. Others suggested he was under immense pressure, advised to stay quiet until the storm passed. But behind closed doors, something very different was happening. According to those close to him, Can Yaman was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he was deciding how much truth the world deserved. The detention itself had already created confusion. One moment, alarming headlines. The next, his release. No clear answers. No official narrative that satisfied public curiosity. And in that vacuum, rumors grew faster than facts. Every hour without a response added fuel to the fire. What many didn't realize was that Can was preparing something far more powerful than a spontaneous reaction. He wasn't interested in defending himself emotionally. He wasn't looking to play the victim. His concern was different: control. Control over his words. Control over the message. Control over how history would remember that moment. Late at night, while headlines were still circulating, Can reportedly sat alone, going over the same sentences again and again. Not to soften them. Not to dramatize them. But to make sure they couldn't be twisted. Because he knew one thing very well. Once he spoke, there would be no turning back. The Turkish press had already chosen its tone. Some outlets demanded explanations. Others hinted at darker narratives. And then there were those waiting for a mistake, a poorly chosen word, an emotional outburst, anything that could be used to escalate the story. That's why his silence became unbearable for them. And then, suddenly, it ended. Not with a long interview. Not with a dramatic appearance. But with one message. Short. Direct. Carefully constructed. When that message reached the Turkish press, the reaction was immediate. Because it didn't sound like an apology. And it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like something else entirely: clarity. Can Yaman didn't deny the seriousness of the situation. But he refused to accept the narrative that had been built around him. His words drew a clear line between facts and speculation, between reality and media-driven assumptions. And that alone was enough to change the tone of the conversation. Journalists who had expected emotion were met with precision. Those waiting for excuses received responsibility without submission. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was controlled. And that control unsettled many. Because the message wasn't just about the detention. It was about boundaries. For the first time since the incident, Can Yaman wasn't reacting to the press. He was addressing it. On his terms. With his timing. And with a calm confidence that suggested he knew far more than he was willing to share. Within hours, headlines changed. The language softened. The speculation slowed. Some outlets quietly revised their tone. Others chose to highlight only fragments of his words, avoiding the parts that challenged their earlier assumptions. And the public noticed. Fans began to read between the lines. Support grew louder. Questions shifted. The story was no longer just about what had happened during the detention, it was about why Can Yaman had waited, and what that silence truly meant. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement isn't made immediately. It's made when everyone else has already spoken too much. And Can Yaman had just done exactly that. Can Yaman's message didn't cause shock because of what it revealed. It caused shock because of what it refused to give. The Turkish press was prepared for a familiar script. An emotional response. A defensive explanation. A carefully framed denial that could be dissected, questioned, and reshaped into new headlines. What they received instead was something far more difficult to handle. A message that offered clarity without surrender. For journalists who thrive on reaction, this was deeply unsettling. Can's words were calm, measured, and strikingly restrained. He did not attack the media, but he also did not seek their approval. He acknowledged the situation without dramatizing it. He addressed the detention without allowing it to define him. And most importantly, he refused to engage in speculation. This refusal disrupted the momentum of the story. Several media outlets had already invested in a narrative built on assumptions. Anonymous sources. Dramatic language. Suggestive phrasing designed to provoke emotion rather than inform. Can Yaman's message quietly dismantled that structure by introducing something unexpected: control. Within newsrooms, the shift was immediate. Editors hesitated. Headlines were rewritten. Phrases like alleged and unconfirmed began to appear more frequently. The certainty that had fueled earlier coverage suddenly evaporated. Because Can's message left very little room for interpretation without risking credibility. What frustrated some journalists most was his tone. It wasn't apologetic, but it wasn't confrontational either. It suggested confidence without arrogance. Responsibility without submission. And that balance made it impossible to provoke him further without appearing aggressive. Behind the scenes, conversations intensified. Some reporters questioned whether they had gone too far. Others doubled down, determined to extract more from the situation. But there was a problem: Can wasn't playing the game. He wasn't responding to follow-up questions. He wasn't offering additional comments. He had said what he needed to say, and stopped. That silence, this time, was intentional. Sources within the media industry later admitted that his message forced a rare moment of reflection. Not because it threatened legal action. Not because it exposed errors directly. But because it shifted the power dynamic. The story was no longer unfolding according to the press's rhythm. Public reaction only amplified this shift. Fans and neutral observers alike began to quote parts of Can's message, highlighting its precision and calm. Social media conversations changed tone. Instead of asking what did he do, people began asking why was the coverage so aggressive in the first place. That question made many uncomfortable. Some outlets attempted to reframe the story, focusing on Can's career, his international presence, or his past professionalism. Others quietly reduced coverage altogether. The detention, once the centerpiece, began to fade into the background. But the tension remained. Because Can Yaman had done something rare, he had reminded the press that access does not equal control. And for an industry built on immediacy and reaction, that reminder was not welcome. The message had not resolved everything. It hadn't answered every question. But it had drawn a clear boundary, one that the Turkish media could not easily cross without exposing its own methods. And perhaps that was the most powerful part of all. Can Yaman hadn't just spoken after his detention. He had redefined the conversation. Publicly, Can Yaman's message appeared calm and controlled. Privately, however, the atmosphere was anything but. Behind closed doors, his words triggered a chain reaction that few outside the media world fully understood. The message may have been short, but its impact extended far beyond what was published. In newsrooms, on private calls, and in editorial meetings, one question kept resurfacing: how far could this story go now? Some journalists felt blindsided. They had expected Can to respond emotionally or defensively, giving them material to prolong the narrative. Instead, he had removed their leverage. His message offered no cracks, no contradictions, no dramatic language that could be twisted into fresh controversy. And that made certain people nervous. Sources close to the situation reveal that shortly after the message was released, several media figures attempted to re-establish contact. Not publicly, but privately. Requests for clarifications. Invitations for exclusive interviews. Subtle attempts to regain access. But Can Yaman declined most of them. That decision marked a turning point. For years, Can had maintained a professional, respectful relationship with the press. Even when coverage was uncomfortable, he rarely closed doors completely. This time was different. The detention, and the way it had been reported, changed something fundamental. According to insiders, Can felt a line had been crossed. Not legally, but ethically. He wasn't upset about tough questions. He was disturbed by speculation presented as certainty, by assumptions repeated until they felt like facts. And that realization led to a difficult conclusion: not every journalist deserved a response. This stance set shockwaves through certain media circles. Some reporters reacted with frustration. Others with quiet concern. Because access to Can Yaman was no small thing. His international career, his cross-border appeal, and his ability to generate headlines had always made him a valuable figure. Losing that access meant losing relevance. Behind the scenes, debates intensified. Editors discussed whether continuing the story was worth the risk of appearing unfair. Others questioned whether pushing further might provoke a response that would turn public opinion decisively against them. And then there were those who simply waited, hoping Can would break his silence again. He didn't. Instead, Can focused on tightening his inner circle. Communication became selective. Statements were filtered. Trust was no longer assumed, it had to be earned. This shift wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. The message to the Turkish press had done more than clarify a situation. It had exposed vulnerabilities within the media ecosystem itself. It showed how quickly narratives could spiral without verified information. And it forced some uncomfortable self-examination. Meanwhile, fans began to sense that something had changed. Can Yaman's public presence became more intentional. Less reactive. Each appearance felt deliberate, measured. As if every move carried a message without words. What many didn't realize was that the detention had accelerated a transformation already in progress. Can was no longer willing to play the role expected of him. The obedient celebrity. The endlessly available figure. He was choosing distance. And in doing so, he was quietly redefining his relationship with the Turkish press, not through confrontation, but through absence. The message had been delivered. The boundaries had been set. And the consequences were unfolding in silence. What followed Can Yaman's message to the Turkish press was not immediate chaos, but something far more decisive. A slow, undeniable shift in direction. Careers don't usually change overnight. They change when a person stops reacting and starts choosing. That message marked exactly that moment. Internationally, the reaction was very different from what happened in Turkey. While parts of the Turkish media struggled with the loss of control over the narrative, foreign outlets took note of something else entirely: composure. To them, Can Yaman didn't look like a man recovering from a scandal. He looked like someone drawing a line. Industry insiders began to whisper that Can had reached a turning point long before the detention itself. The incident merely accelerated a decision that had been forming quietly. He would no longer allow his career to be shaped by constant commentary, speculation, or pressure to explain himself. This change didn't come without cost. Some doors in Turkey closed, or at least became colder. Certain interview opportunities disappeared. Invitations slowed. The unspoken rule was clear: access had consequences. But Can seemed prepared for that. In fact, those close to him say he expected it. What mattered more was what opened elsewhere. Producers and collaborators outside Turkey viewed the situation differently. They saw a public figure capable of restraint, someone who didn't crumble under pressure, someone who understood timing. In an industry where impulsive reactions often destroy credibility, Can's silence followed by a controlled message stood out. Behind the scenes, discussions about his future projects took on a new tone. Less reactive. More strategic. The focus shifted away from damage control and toward positioning. Can wasn't just protecting his image anymore, he was redefining it. And that was no accident. The message to the Turkish press had served a dual purpose. On the surface, it addressed the detention. Beneath that, it communicated something much larger: independence. Can Yaman was signaling that he would no longer participate in narratives that reduced him to headlines. This realization unsettled many. Because it meant that the usual cycle, incident, outrage, reaction, redemption, no longer applied. Ken had stepped outside of it. And once someone does that, there's no easy way to pull them back in. Fans sensed it too. They noticed a shift in how Can presented himself. Fewer explanations. More boundaries. Appearances that felt intentional rather than obligatory. The message had changed expectations, not just for the media, but for the public. What made this moment irreversible was not the detention itself, but Can's response to it. He had chosen dignity over visibility, control over immediacy. And in doing so, he had accepted the consequences. Because every boundary creates distance. And Can Yaman was no longer afraid of that distance. The story was no longer about clearing his name. It was about deciding what kind of career, and what kind of life, he wanted moving forward. The message had closed one chapter, but it had also made it clear that the next one would be written on his terms. The Turkish press had heard him. And so had everyone else. Time has passed since Can Yaman's detention, but the message he sent afterward has not faded. In fact, it has grown louder with distance. Because some statements don't reveal their power immediately. They reveal it through what follows. What made that message unforgettable was not its length or its wording, but its consequence. Can Yaman didn't return to business as usual. He didn't rush to rebuild visibility. He didn't attempt to win back headlines. Instead, he allowed silence to do the work, this time, on his terms. And that choice changed everything. Today, when his name comes up in discussions about the Turkish media, the conversation is different. It's no longer centered on the detention itself, but on how he handled it. On restraint. On timing. On the rare decision to step back rather than fight publicly. Industry observers now point to that moment as a line in the sand. Before the detention, Can Yaman was often expected to explain himself. After it, he stopped accepting that role. The message to the Turkish press wasn't just a response. It was a reset. It signaled the end of automatic access, the end of emotional reactions, the end of narratives built without consent. And that is why it still matters. Some journalists quietly admit that his words forced them to reconsider how stories are shaped when facts are incomplete. Others remain critical, but noticeably more cautious. The tone has changed. The assumptions have softened. The confidence to speculate has diminished. Because Can didn't challenge the press directly. He challenged the process. For fans, that moment became something else entirely. It wasn't about defending a favorite celebrity. It was about watching someone refuse to be reduced to a headline. Support didn't come from sympathy, it came from respect. Can Yaman didn't ask to be understood. He made it clear that understanding was no longer a requirement. That's why the message continues to be referenced long after the incident itself. It represents a turning point not just in his career, but in how public figures can respond when the spotlight turns hostile. Calm instead of chaos. Boundaries instead of explanations. The detention may have triggered the moment, but the message defined it. And perhaps the most striking part of all is this: Can Yaman never followed up. No second statement. No clarification tour. No attempt to reclaim the narrative once it had shifted. He said what needed to be said. And then he stopped. In an industry addicted to constant noise, that restraint became his loudest statement. That is why, even now, his message to the Turkish press is remembered not as damage control, but as control itself.